we're somewhere in the notes with evolution. I think we left off, let's see, we covered all of E in your notes, maybe about page 5 in your last session notes. I think we're on letter F. So we've been talking about Darwinian evolution. I think I told you the story maybe last week or the week before, I don't know when I was at Long Beach City College, and evolutionary biologist, professor, retired, asked me a question during the Q&A time. It was a panel. So there was the atheist, the witch, the Muslim guy, and myself, and I got asked a question about evolution, actually 2 questions. I had time restraint. I could only answer one. Afterwards, he came up and he asked me, "You didn't answer my question." I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to avoid it. I had a time restraint." I said, "What was your question?" He said, "What do you think about evolution?" And I said, "I think it's bad philosophy and horrible science." And then he went ballistic on me and started berating and criticizing and yelling at me and getting in my face of how stupid and ignorant I was. I stand by my statement. I think that Darwinian evolution is bad science. I think it's even worse philosophy. So Elvin Planiga, who is the editor of the book Naturalism Defeated, he talks about how naturalism, which is not synonymous with Darwinian evolution, but it's pretty close, it's methodological naturalism, is self-defeating. It cannot support itself. If methodological naturalism or naturalism were true, it actually defeats itself. It is like blowing up the bridge and trying to build the bridge, but you're blowing it up. So it won't work. I kind of cringe and I laugh and I cry all at the same time when somebody says that evolution is scientific fact. That's just plain not true. Now, if I concede that evolution is theoretically true, or it could be theoretically true, which I don't even think it can theoretically be true, but if I concede that as a debate point, I just say, well, yeah, okay, it could be true. You cannot prove it scientifically because science technically deals with observable phenomena. You're going to have to observe it. So if I say water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit when it's at 1 atmosphere pressure and the water is completely pure, it doesn't have any sediments dissolved in it so as to change its vapor pressure or boiling point. And I can prove that to you. I can put a beaker of water, pure water, 1 atmosphere pressure. We can put a thermocouple in it to register the temperature. We can bring it up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. We can wait until the entire beaker reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and we begin to see the bubbles, the vapor pressure bubbles, starts boiling. So I can show that to you. I can repeat it over and over and over and over again endlessly for you, and you can observe it with your own eyes, and you can read the temperature reading and all the other data, and we can do it over and over again. That is provable scientifically because we're dealing with a physical thing, water, and we're dealing with something that we can directly observe as a human observer. That's impossible to do related to evolution because by definition, evolution happens over hundreds of millions of years. Extremely small genetic changes that confer a functional advantage on the organism. And because of natural selection, as she is extremely wise, natural selection scrutinizes every change in the organism, which is not really coherent with natural selection because natural selection is impersonal, unsupervised, chance process. So they deposit things in this discussion that are not depositable, that don't exist within this system. So even if it were true, you can't observe it. You can't observe an amoeba going to a hydra, or a fish going to a lizard, or a fish going to a duck. It's not observable. You can't observe it because nobody lives hundreds of millions of years to watch this process happen over a long period of time. So when they say that evolution is a scientific fact, I think they're being excessively dishonest. They're not really being true to science. Science can only deal with physical things, physical objects. Now, organisms are physical objects, I grant you that. So, letter F, we're discussing some problems with evolution. First thing is the impossibility of life coming from non-life. So in the film Unlocking the Mysteries of Life's Origin, Darwin never dealt with the issue of how did life originally start. He never addressed the question. Not in his formal writings, he just guessed at it with that one letter to his chemist friend. And then later the film said, you know, Alexander Oparin actually developed, a Russian chemist actually developed a detailed chemical theory which actually happens to be proven false by the data. Dean Kenyon at San Francisco State University, who wrote the book Biochemical Predestination. His book broke down, and he actually rejects his book about 5 years after he actually wrote it. There is no chemical affinity towards various molecules to form protein molecules. But you've got a sheet in your notes that talks about statistical probability. Probability and the molecular evolution of proteins. So, if we theoretically allow for a haphazard, naturalistic, chance environment where proteins are actually formed, it's not going to happen, it doesn't happen, but even if it did happen, you got a couple of problems. The probability of it happening are basically, practically speaking, zero. And then secondly, even if you get proteins by molecular evolution, that has no necessary connection with the formation of life. Now, granted, you need proteins in order to have life forms. Granted, I understand that. But simply because you have protein molecules doesn't mean that you're going to or you can get life. There's more to life than just proteins. You don't throw proteins in a beaker and you automatically have fish or lizards or whatever. It takes a lot more than just proteins for it. So, probability. Assume the following false concessions were granted. Assume the primitive atmosphere of ammonia and hydrogen gas existed around the Earth's atmosphere, high concentrations of it, particularly hydrogen, because you need a reducing atmosphere, which means hydrogen, versus an oxidizing atmosphere, which is oxygen. In order for amino acids, which are necessary in order to get proteins, you need a reducing atmosphere in order for amino acids to be formed and not to be destroyed. Because if there's oxygen present, oxygen will react with those amino acids and destroy them. So oxygen's not good for the equation. So you have to assume a strongly reducing environment around the Earth's atmosphere. That's actually a false assumption. Hydrogen is too light of a gas to be held in by the gravitational attraction of our planet. So very light molecules like methane gas or hydrogen gas is going to escape our atmosphere. A little bit heavier molecules like nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide will actually be largely held into our atmosphere because of the gravitational attraction. So it's a false assumption, totally false. And if one is false, there's probably no need to go to the rest of them, but we will for discussion's sake. Assume that all 20 amino acids form naturally in the proper proportions. Isn't going to happen. Only left-handed amino acids are formed. It's categorically false. You're going to have both left and right-handed amino acids formed. Now you're going to have to probably separate them somehow chemically to isolate only left-handed ones. Because for life forms, you need exclusively left-handed amino acids. If you have right-handed amino acids, you might as well throw them away because they're useless for life. The average length is 400 units, smaller than the 445 calculated for the smallest theoretical cell, not the cell in reality, but a theoretical one. All the atoms on Earth were used to form amino acids. Now, we know that that's false. Amino acids are grouped in sets, and each one is available for further reaction. Amino acids are protected from the destructive effects of ultraviolet light. That's false, not unless you got them in a cave someplace. Amino acids automatically unite without enzymes. Sorry, it won't happen. One substitute allowed at each side of the chain. Chains form at a rate of 10 to the 42nd power per year, and each chain forms in 1/3 of a million billionth of a second, 150,000 trillion times the normal speed in living cells. 150,000 trillion times faster than normal cells. But we'll give it to you. Usable chains are dismantled and recombined at the same rate, so you don't lose anything. Nothing interferes, and once a usable chain forms, the process stops before it breaks apart. If 239 proteins in contiguous sets form, they'll emerge into one group. False. 14 is the only thing I think is true. Assume the Earth's age to be 5 billion. I think about 4.5 billion, actually. In the universe, 15 billion, this says. I think it's about now, the number is probably down to about 13.7 billion years. So, because evolution takes lots of time. So we'll assume that we have an old universe, 13.7 or 14 billion. Under these conditions, what is the chance, statistically speaking, that a usable protein molecule would ever form by molecular evolution? One protein molecule. Not hundreds of thousands. Not that life would form, that you'd get an amoeba, or you'd get one cell that would help you to get some type of living organism, whether it's bacterium or an amoeba. Probably the simplest might be bacteria. So bacteria is living, has the ability to replicate and reproduce, but it's extremely, quote, simple, but it's really not simple, as we talked about in the movie, the bacteria flagellum. It's not very simple, but it's about as simple as you're going to get. But when you look at it, it's actually excessively complex. So we're talking just one protein molecule. We're not talking about even a cell, one cell. We're a long ways off from a cell and a long ways off from any type of living organism. One protein molecule, one chance in 10 to the 161st power. What's the chance of getting one minimum set of 239 proteins for a cell? One chance in almost 10 to the 120,000th power. What's the chance of getting one workable set of genes? You don't have living organisms even when you have genes. You need genes in order to get the living organism, because the genes contain the information to put the cell together, the assembling instructions. So you need the assembly instructions before you can get the cell. So we're just talking about the blueprint. We don't have bricks and 2x4s and nails and carpet and mortar and cement yet to build a building. We need the blueprint before we start building, so we know what we're going to build. So the genes are the blueprint. What's a chance of getting one workable set of genes? One chance in 10 to the 578,000th power. Some examples of extremely large numbers. The age of the universe, 15 billion years in seconds, 10 to the 18th. Number of inches across the universe, 10 to the 28th. Number of angstrom units. An angstrom is a measurement to measure like the distance from the nucleus to the first electron in a subatomic particle, or in the molecule, or an atom. Extremely small measurement. Number of angstrom units across the universe, 4 times 10 to the 37th power. The weight of the Milky Way in grams, 3 times 10 to the 41st power. The number of atoms in the universe, 5 times 10 to the 78th power. If each atom were expanded into an entirely new universe of 200 billion galaxies, and you summed up the total of atoms in those multiplicity of 200 billion new universes, how many atoms would there be in that multiplicity of universes? 2.5 times 10 to the 157th power. When I had physical chemistry in college, was a course, all my friends just absolutely hated it, and I was very much in agreement with them. I did not like the course. It was a terrible class, especially when we got to, well, the thing I'm thinking about is when we got to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a certain division of physical chemistry. The other 2 quarters of physical chemistry was very hard, but I actually liked it. But quantum mechanics, I didn't like it. It was a nasty course. It was a combination of chemistry, physics, and calculus all put together. And it was extremely abstract type of course, very, very abstract, very theoretical. And my fellow students in the class that didn't even believe in God, they had a very active prayer life that quarter, because they were praying that they would pass the course. They weren't praying for an A, they were praying for a C or a D. This was just a nasty course. It was hard. And my professor said, yeah, he said, I have to warn you, he said, because my professor's professor committed suicide, and the guy that actually that had him as a student, he committed suicide, and that guy that became a professor that committed suicide, I was his student, and so you're taking your life into your own hands by having me as a professor and being my student. So and he was serious as far as his 2 professors before him that had committed suicide. Maybe physical chemistry contributed to that problem. And so one day in class, he had a discussion, because we're kind of clueless, but he said, we could calculate on paper the possibility of because molecules vibrate. Every piece of matter is vibrating. There's an oscillation with molecules because of temperature and because of that energy agitation. So molecules are actually vibrating. And he said, we could calculate the probability of all the molecules in Mount Everest vibrating in the same direction at the same time. And if they're on the same plane, they're not only in that direction, but they're all in this plane, not this plane or this plane. They're all in the same plane, the same direction at the same time. There's actually a statistical probability of Mount Everest actually jumping 10 feet based upon molecular vibration. And I thought, well, that's cute. But you know what? It ain't never going to happen. Molecular vibration based upon whatever the temperature is there in Mount Everest, it's quite a bit of gradient. Maybe it's 50 degrees at the base of the mountain, probably about 0 degrees or 20 below at the top of the mountain. It ain't going to happen. But we can calculate, he could calculate the probability. He could put a number on a piece of paper. Well, I would guess, now he's probably dead, I'm sure, because I was a student about 35 years ago. So he's probably dead by now. He's pretty old when I had him as a professor. He had very, very poor eyesight, so he could never see anybody in the classroom. He'd know there's people there, but he couldn't tell who was where because his eyesight was so bad. So he'd pick on different people. He'd say, Diane, where are you today? And she'd sit way in the back, She did not want to be pestered by him, because he would always pick on her. Diane, do you know the answer to this question, And I was about his third go-to, If Diane wasn't there or George wasn't there, then Rittenhouse was the one to go to. So he'd hassle me. Rittenhouse, do you know the answer to this question? No, sir, I do not. Haven't you been reading your book? Yeah, yes, professor. I read it 3 times, but I still don't understand it. It was a hard glass. So, simply because I can put a number on a piece of paper doesn't mean that event can happen. And the likelihood of Mount Everest, all the molecules vibrating in the same direction at the same time, that probability is a much higher probability than what we looked at with getting one set of genes. In fact, it's astronomically higher than getting one set of genes. Do you think there's any possibility of Mount Everest actually jumping 10 feet based upon molecular vibration? No. Now, I don't have to just have a gut reaction to it. William Dembski actually wrote a book dealing with not Mount Everest, but he dealt with probabilities. So he's got a book that he wrote called, it was on the film, Intelligent Design, Eliminating Chance by Small Probabilities. And they talked about it briefly. And he talked about a particular paradigm that he has for determining if something can actually happen. And this is related to intelligent design. So his filter for detecting design. First thing he talked about, is it necessary or is it contingent? When a liquid freezes, it's going to get to be solid. It's kind of a tautology almost. So it's not surprising to me then when you take a liquid substance, you drop the temperature, and that liquid eventually becomes a solid. That's a necessary thing that will happen with liquids when you drop the temperature. They'll get to their freezing point. It's not uncommon. It's necessary. It will happen. But if you have something that happens that's contingent, it's not demanded by the system, then you have to look forward. You have to look further. Is this change simple or is it complex? So when water freezes, it becomes a solid. Well, that's necessary. If it were contingent, you'd look, well, is that a simple change or a very complex change? So when water freezes, it develops a crystalline structure. But that's an extremely simple change. Another example. Did you know that glass, our windows here in the back, do you know that glass is actually a liquid? Did you know that? How many knew that? It's a liquid. Yeah, it's a liquid. If you take old glass, like probably in these windows, and you measure the thickness at the bottom versus the top, the bottom will actually be thicker than the top is by a small amount. That glass, which is a liquid, is actually flowing. It's actually dropping down. Some of the molecules are actually migrating downward because it's a liquid. There's a very easy way to make it into a solid. If I were to take a nice heavy object, maybe I took, Caitlin's laptop and I threw it really hard at that window and that laptop hits that window and it shatters, the glass now becomes a solid. now crystallizes. But that crystallization of that glass is very simple. So Dembski is looking at this filter as we look at, say, life forms, as we look at the bacteria flagellum. Is it necessary or is it contingent that this bacteria flagellum has this complex motor system? Well, it's not necessary. Could have been something else. So it's contingent, doesn't have to be the way it is. Is it simple or is it complex? It's extremely, extremely complex. Is this complexity ad hoc? You know, it's kind of just random chance. It just, you know, you threw up 50 quarters in the air and they all landed heads up, stacked on top of one another. It's not necessary, it's contingent. It's more complex than it is simple, but it could be potentially ad hoc. But he says if it's highly specific, then you have found design. So it has to be contingent. It doesn't have to be the way it is. It has to be complex, not simple. And it has to be very specific, not ad hoc. So I don't know if you remember on the film when they are talking about information, an information-rich source coming from someplace in the universe. And he says it would have to be something that's very specific, not ad hoc. And not a pattern that you impose on the system, but a pattern that's structured and specific, that's inherent to the information. And his example was prime numbers. Some entity from outer space communicating with us through prime numbers. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. That's not ad hoc. That's highly specific. It's not necessary, it's contingent. It's somewhat complex. So he says those elements give us indication that actually design is present. So, impossibility of life coming from non-life. Ain't going to happen. And we've already talked about it last week, which I think we're going to hit on it a little bit also again this week, the Miller-Urey experiment. Number 2 in your notes, the absurdity of complex design from random accidents. Dean Kenyon, in his Biological Predestination, has concluded now based upon new research, quote, I now concur that there is a fundamental flaw in all current theories of the chemical origins of life, end quote. One, chemicals don't have an affinity for one another in the sense of forming amino acids or proteins. Second, even if you got the proteins, you have to have the assembly instructions. Where do you get the assembly instructions? You can't get it from the molecules. Assembly instructions are information. Information is not a physical substance. Information is a non-physical substance. Science says the only thing that matters is matter because matter is the only thing that exists. So science doesn't have an answer to where you're going to get the information in order to assemble these proteins. Strobel, in his book Case for Faith, says, the idea that undirected processes could somehow be responsible for turning dead chemicals into all the complexity of life, of living things, is surely, as microbiologist Dean Denton observed, no more nor less than the greatest cosmogenic myth of our times. It's a myth. Chemicals aren't going to give us proteins or life. Isn't going to happen. But in the naturalistic culture, or in the context of methodological naturalism, two problems. With the upper echelon, the academia, the scientists, they believe it's the only possible way to do science, methodological naturalism. For the guy down in the street, maybe say college students, high school students, this is the only thing they've heard. So sometimes when I have an interaction with college students, which I do frequently, or high school students, and evolution will come up. Sometimes it comes up almost as a counterfactual argument against the existence of God. So I talk about God, and they're like, yeah, but, evolution. I'm like, what about evolution? Evolution doesn't discount the existence of God. But while we're at it, let's talk about evolution. And they'll say to me, well, evolution is a scientific fact. Who told you that? Oh, my high school biology teacher told me that. I'm like, really? I am sorry to inform you that's not true. But he's heard this his whole life. And so he just assumes that it's true. Now, the analogy is dissimilar, but it's the same kind of, it's been told so many times in America, Americans believe it. One in the arena of the Constitution. I get this when I get into discussions about freedom and stuff in religion. They'll say, well, you know, in the United States, the Constitution says there's separation of church and state. It doesn't say that in the United States Constitution. In fact, it says quite the opposite. It does say it in the Constitution of the USSR, or what used to be the former Soviet Union. But in America, there is not separation of church and state. But when I get into discussion with secular college students, high school students, practically everybody in America, they give me the same, well, you know, there's separation of church and state in America. You know, that's what our country was founded on, separation. I'm like, dude, no. One of the first acts of Congress was to print Bibles at government expense and give them to all those in the armed forces of the United States. You know what's printed on the top of the Washington Monument? Quote from the Bible. Do you know what's engraved in the Lincoln Memorial? Quote from the Bible. Do you know what's on the top of the rotunda in the Library of Congress? A quote from the Bible. Do you know what the picture is behind the Supreme Court justices in the main discussion chamber when they hear cases? It's an angel holding a sword, pointing down to an open book. Guess what the book is? The Bible. Our country has employed a full-time professional pastor as chaplain of the United States Senate since the inception of our country. Still employed, paid by tax dollars. 9 out of 13 original colonies had a state-established religion, Christian religion. Maryland was Catholic. Pennsylvania was Quaker. Rhode Island was Baptist. And they paid the ministers of that denomination from state tax dollars. Separation of church and state, you don't know what the heck you're talking about. But every American practically that's under about 50 years of age believes this. And in the same way of they've heard it so many times, well, you know, evolution is a scientific fact. Science has proven evolution. I'm like, duh, no. Why did Stephen Gould, the brilliant Harvard biologist who's an atheist, reject Darwinian evolution? Because he's dumb? No, he's a very intelligent man. He's dead now. He died about 5-6 years ago. You're not going to be a professor teaching at Harvard if you're on the bottom of your class. You're going to have a lot of brain power. You're going to have to be probably pretty good in your field. Stephen Gould was a world-class biologist, but he's an atheist. So he cannot consider intelligent design or a creator in his worldview as he thinks about origins of life. It's not available to him. But he rejects Darwinian evolution. Why? Because the fossil record does not support it. And he's smart enough to know it doesn't support it. But he's an atheist. He knows that evolution is true. Why? Because it's the only option he has available to him. So he comes up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium, which we talked about last week with Mother Rabbit giving birth to a cat after she stores up all these genetic changes. So when evolutionists give me the party line, well, you know, Darwinian evolution is a proven scientific fact. Stephen Gould didn't think so. Are you going to call Stephen Gould stupid simply because he doesn't buy the party line? That's what I get sometimes from college students. Every time I was at UC Davis, I was doing my lecture, I think, on Stump the Professor. And afterwards I had, well, when I got the Q&A, I had some questions from a group of about 4 atheists. Then after we closed off the Q&A time, they came up, they had some more discussion with me for probably about another half an hour to 45 minutes. And every time I would begin to quote a scientist, Michael Behe, Stephen Meyer, Paul Nelson, every time I quoted a particular scientist, all that have PhD degrees. They didn't graduate from Podunk, who knows what university. They graduated from USC and UCLA and Berkeley, some halfway decent universities. They all have PhD degrees. Jonathan Wells has 2 PhD degrees. one in embryology, one in biology. I would say he's somewhat qualified to make comments about biology and embryology. But every time I would quote these guys, my critic, a junior at UC Davis, would say, well, he's not a scholar. I'd say, why is he not a scholar? I'll tell you why he's not a scholar in your viewpoint, because he disagrees with your viewpoint. And you throw everybody away that doesn't agree with your assumption about Darwinian evolution. But I differ with you. These men are scholars. I don't discard Stephen Gould. Well, he's an evolutionist. I can't trust him. He doesn't know anything. I said, that's bad on my part, and it's wrong on your part to discount these scholars simply because you don't like their conclusions. You challenge their scholarship, then you show me why they're not qualified. Simply because they don't agree with your point of view? This is juvenile. I don't discount Stephen Gould because I don't agree with his position. He's a scholar. He's a very intelligent man. I respect his intelligence and his position. I don't agree with his conclusion. But simply because I don't agree with his conclusion, I don't say, well, he doesn't know anything. He's not a scholar. That's juvenile for me to say something like that. So I finally called the student on it. I said, you think everybody's opinion is worthless unless it agrees with your opinion. Quite frankly, you're not qualified to make the judgment. What year in school are you? Oh, a junior. What's your major? Computer science. Oh, computer science. But you're evaluating biologists and embryologists and philosophers and theologians and geneticists. You haven't even had a course in any of those areas. I would dare say you're not qualified to even make a judgment whether or not they're a scholar or not. Light bulb finally went on. Finally went on. He's like, you're right. I said, thank you. Thank you for admitting it. Maybe you ought to listen more. Maybe it's, the good Lord gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Maybe he wants you to listen twice as much as you talk. Because when you're talking, you know what? You're not learning anything, are you? He finally got a tad bit more teachable. Number 3 in your notes. The lack of evidence in the fossil record. David Rupp, curator of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, observes, he's an evolutionist, quote, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time, end quote. How many intermediate fossils do we have? We actually have 0. They will talk about the vestral fins on whales, that they can't figure out what the use of those fins are on the whales, and they'll say, well, that's a leftover from their evolutionary development. How do you know that? Were you there to observe it? Did you have an interview with Mr. and Mrs. Whale? Did you interview the children? Have you been able to observe this species for 10 million years? Duh. How do you know this? This is astronomical assumption that even if it were true, there's no way that they know it. But, quote, evolution is a scientific fact. I get angry over that. It's not a scientific fact. Even if it were true, it's not provable scientifically. Or Archaeopteryx. Half bird, supposedly half reptile. And they say, oh man, Archaeopteryx. Yeah, there's a tiny bit of a problem though. Tiny bit of a problem because Archaeopteryx actually existed 75 million years before its dad did. So it can't be descendant from the species that you actually said it descended from, because it actually pre-existed by 75 million years before the thing you actually said it was supposedly descended from. Is that in the textbooks? No. The film, The Icons of Evolution. Jonathan Wells wrote the book. We're going to be talking about it in a second. But there's also a film by the same title. They interviewed various educators that are committed evolutionists. And they called them on these 10 icons, all of which are false, related to evolution, such as Archaeopteryx. And they called them on it. They said, why is this in the textbook? It's not true. Why doesn't the textbook say this Archaeopteryx existed 75 million years prior to when its supposed ancestor existed. That's false. And oh yeah, we know it's false, but it still represents the reality and the truth of evolution. Stanley Miller's experiments with ammonia gas and hydrogen gas and carbon dioxide and water vapor in a closed system with sparks in it. He gets two simple amino acids, neither of which are useful for life formation. And he gets a mixture of left and right-handed ones, not exclusively left. All of his assumptions are false. The primitive atmosphere around the Earth did not have ammonia gas and hydrogen gas. Why? This does not represent the primitive conditions on planet Earth in our atmosphere. Well, yeah, that's true. They agree. The evolutionists agree. That's true. Why do you still have Stanley Miller's experiment in the textbook as evidence for evolution when you know it's false? Yeah, we do know it's false, but it represents the reality and the truth of evolution. And this is heralded as a scientific theory? What do you do when the data doesn't fit the theory? What happens when all the data, or the vast majority of the data, is contradictory to theory? A good scientist changes the theory. Scientists used to believe that metal, like aluminum, iron, that metal, when it was heated, would get rid of a substance. It was called phlogiston. Phlogiston was a substance that had negative weight. Figure that one out. So you have these molecules of this particular chemical, which they never identified, of course, and this stuff has negative weight. And when you heat the metal, this phlogiston, which has negative weight, leaves the metal, and therefore the metal increases in weight because it got rid of the negative weight material. This sounds like having a square without sides. Having a material substance that has negative weight? This was the popular concept in chemistry for a while. Until they figured out when you heat a metal, it actually reacts with the surrounding atmosphere, particularly oxygen, and the metal oxidizes, and it takes oxygen on in its structure, and it increases in weight because it's adding a material substance, specifically oxygen. But chemists propose this theory of phlogiston that has negative weight. But it's false. It's false. It's wrong. So what did they do when the data showed that their theory was wrong? Oh, we gotta worship phlogiston. We gotta worship it. Oh, we'd never want to give it up. Phlogiston is our God. We can't get rid of it. No, a good scientist throws the theory out and says, you know what? We were wrong. And looking back, it was kind of dumb for us to think that material substance had negative weight. How could a material substance have negative weight? It's like having a very nice house that doesn't exist. A square without sides. It's an oxymoron. So they changed the theory. Are we going to change the theory about Darwinian evolution when the data doesn't fit? A lot of them are going to say no. Why? Because it's the only theory that we have. It's a choice between methodological naturalism and methodological naturalism. If I got those two choices, I guess I'm going to choose methodological naturalism. Come hell or high water, I ain't going to change my viewpoint, because if I do, I have to give up science. That's why there's such a strong resistance in the scientific community as we propose intelligent design. Because they think to actually consider intelligent design is actually giving up the scientific enterprise. Kind of like you're involved in magic or voodoo to do science, instead of something that's actually a rational proposition. There is an incredible level of resistance to intelligent design. This is where science used to be in the past. They acknowledge that the Creator exists. And that's why we're going to investigate our universe, because God made this universe, and God is a God of design and perfection and order. Therefore, we should be able to investigate the universe and actually describe it. Einstein said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. why should it be comprehensible if it's just randomness? Why should I be able to write formulas with an equal sign? E equals mc squared? Equal sign? Why? Because there's a designer that was very ordered in his design of this universe. Every time I ask the evolutionists for evidence, for evolution, for speciation. Now, they like to use the word evolution related to adaptation, but I don't like that. I think adaptation is adaptation. Adaptation is not evolution. But every time I ask them to give me evidence for macroevolution, the amoeba going to a lizard, a fish going to a turtle, that type of species change, every time I ask them for scientific evidence, they opt back to adaptation examples. Darwin's finches. Galapagos Islands, Darwin's finches. That proves it. The peppered moth in Great Britain, the moth, it changed colors. Actually, it was a forgery, but we'll get to that. The peppered moth, it went from white to black. Darwin's finches, baby. That proves evolution. I'm like, really? It proves evolution? Did any of the finches become ostriches? Did any of the finches become dogs or cows? Horses? And they play this, I like to call the shell game. You ever see that demonstrated? You take 3 cups, you put a little ball or something underneath it or a coin, then you kind of, where's the ball? First one. No, you didn't get it. You know, and we'll do it again, you know, and they do the thing, pick again. The middle one. The joke's on you, you know. They're doing the shell game on you. They're trying to fool you where the ball is. This is what they do with evolution. Every time you ask them for information, hey, give me evidence. Give me scientific evidence for macroevolution, speciation. Darwin's finches. Really? Darwin's finches? Yeah, Darwin's. Oh. Well, what did the finches evolve into? Oh, they just changed beak size. Oh, okay, they changed beak size. Oh, yeah. Were they still finches? Well, yeah. So the population distribution went from 13 finches down to 9 finches when the food supply went way down. What happened on the Galapagos Islands the next year when the food source went up really high? What happened to the distribution of finch species? Went back up to 13. What happened 2 years later when the food source went back down again? Went down to 9 finches. What happened 3 years later when the food source went up again? What happened to the distribution of finch population? Went back up to 13. Did any of those finches become hawks? Eagles, ostriches. Did any of them change their particular finch species? Did they go to a new species? Did any of them go to a new species? No. You've not given me an example of speciation. You've given me evidence to say that environmental changes can cause a distribution in the population distribution of the finches. But all the finches stayed finches. Or the peppered moth. Can you show me a moth that became a butterfly? Can you show me 2 different types of bacteria? This is a classic example. Eukaryotic and prokaryotic bacteria. They're both single-celled organisms. Bacteria replicates and changes its genetic structure very rapidly in environmental situations. That's why we have so much problems with infections. We invent new antibiotics to kill bacteria. The bacteria adapts to that antibiotic, that antibacterial infection. It changes its genetic structure a little bit, and it becomes impervious to the drug that we've formed. So our most powerful drugs now are impervious to some of the bacteria because they adapt to the drug. So we would think that we would see migration, a development from prokaryotic bacteria to eukaryotic bacteria. That eukaryotic would go to prokaryotic could become eukaryotic bacteria. Is there any evidence for those bacteria mutating to become the other type of bacteria? Zero. Doesn't happen. Now, if it doesn't happen on the absolutely simplest molecular and cell level, one-celled organism, and bacteria replicate at massive speeds, why do we think we're going to have a finch go to a cow, or a hawk, or an ostrich? This is craziness in my thinking. They never give you scientific evidence for speciation. They give you examples of adaptation. But quite frankly, there's no logical connection. There's no logical connection between adaptation and macroevolution. There's no logical connection. But they want to infer that there's a logical connection, that adaptation somehow is evidential proof or a causative evidence that macroevolution is true. And I disagree. I don't think there's any logical connection between these two. Adaptation is adaptation. You stay with the exact same species. And here you have a different species. Now, I'm sorry for being so anal with the comment, but a different species is a different species. And there's tremendous amount of new genetic information from one species to another. And if we take Darwinian evolution, there's going to be greater complexity with the organ or the organism, greater complexity. So if you go from a cold-blooded creature to a warm-blooded creature, a two-chambered heart to a four-chambered heart, you go from gills to lungs, you have much more complexity with the organs. And you have lots of new genetic information. So there's no logical connection between these two. But for the Darwinian evolutionist, he's going to almost make this to be equal. That adaptation equals macroevolution. I'm sorry. I absolutely will not concede that, because I think it's completely categorically false. There is no logical connection between the two. But they infer that it is, and I'm just going to resist them till hell freezes over. I'm not going to give it to them because I don't think it's true. They have the burden of proof to show me examples, especially since they claim that this is, quote, scientific fact. Scientific fact? Put it in the beaker and let me see it. Let's go to the laboratory. You said you can prove it scientifically. Let's go into the laboratory. You prove it to me in the laboratory. They can't do it. It's not provable scientifically. Even if it were true, which it's not. Number 4, the contradictory assertion of punctuated equilibrium. Philip Johnson says in critiquing this, he says, a scientist who objects to scientific testing is like a banker who doesn't want the books to be audited by independent accountants. View such people with suspicion. It just happens. Punctuated equilibrium. What's the mechanism? That's true.
If one were found and were proven to be an intermediate fossil, how strong of an argument would that be for evolution? I mean, if they prove that one point, is it strong?
I don't think so. I think they would have to have more than one example, but I don't think it's provable even if it were true. So if I assume it's true, and if I assume that there are intermediate fossils, I don't think we can, by observation, know that for a fact. How are we going to know that it's an intermediate fossil? All we have is the skeletal remains. So we've got to make all kinds of assumptions about this, as they did, in fact, with Archaeopteryx. They assumed that it was half reptile, half bird, because of they don't even have the bird. They just have the imprint in the rock where it died. And so they got an outline that was made. So they infer that it had scale-like type of exterior, scale-like, instead of just feathers. Man, that's a pretty big jump in data. How do you know it was scales? Well, because the imprint is very, very rigid. Maybe, but holy man, you're making some pretty big conclusions on pretty limited data. So I could go the route like Michael Behe and some of the guys in the Unlocking the Mysteries of Life's Origin film. Michael Behe says he's come to the conclusion that evolution, Darwinian evolution, is not the complete answer. So I could go that direction. If Darwinian evolution is true, if it were true, I'm willing to accept it, if it's true. I don't have a philosophical objection to it in the sense of it's going to disrupt my worldview, or that I have to stop believing in God or being a Christian if I buy Darwinian evolution. That's not the case. I just think it's false. And it brings up the case, is it possible is it possible for God, would it be possible for God to use evolution or Darwinian evolution to develop life forms? Extreme theoretical discussion, yes. J.P. Moreland says Darwinian evolution, if it's true, does not discount God. That's true. So, is it possible, theoretically, I'm talking out loud, I'm thinking out loud, is it possible for God to imbue living life forms with the ability to form new life forms, new species? Is it possible? I actually think the answer to that question is no. Because to form a new species, you have to have new genetic information. So you're going to have even a mutated form of Darwinian evolution, which turns out not to be Darwinian evolution. Because you're going to have God from an outside source supplying new genetic information to that organism, so when it replicates, it actually has new information to have a new structure and a new species. So in a technical sense, that's not Darwinian evolution. It's divine intervention. It's intelligent design. But there could be some type of theoretical discussion about the marriage between the two. So there's quite a few Christians, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, that are what are called theistic evolutionists. And a good chunk of evangelicals actually are theistic evolutionists. And so they say, God created the universe. Maybe he even created Adam and Eve distinct. Adam didn't come from amoebas or monkeys. But God did also create evolutionary process. So in a sense, from that point of view of theistic evolution is still not technically full-blown Darwinian evolution, because God actually created the evolution and he's supervising this evolution. That's theistic evolution. And that's, in my opinion, very unfortunate, but it's very widespread belief in evangelicals. Not here at Biola, thank the good Lord from my point of view, but other places.
I'm just curious what Genesis 1:24 and 25 mean when it talks about the creatures being created in their kind.
Yeah.
Is that any reference to like them being made as they were and not in a way that they could evolve into something else?
Not necessarily, but it does say there's a distinction and there's a boundary there. So after their kind actually is not as specific as what we use with species. So in modern, paleontology, biology, things like that, we have a little bit more definition with what we mean by species. And that word, after its kind, is actually a little bit broader kind of category. And this is talked about a little bit, well, probably a lot of places, but where I got it was Genesis Question by Hugh Ross. And he talks about that phraseology. And so, but it does seem to have some boundaries, each produced after its kind. So when you take a horse, sometimes get this confused, so if I make a mistake, you can help me. You take a horse and a mule, you get a donkey. Is that the right thing, the donkey? I always get the donkey and mule mixed up. So if you take a horse and you take a mule, you crossbreed them, it produces a donkey. But a donkey is sterile. It can't have any offspring. So there's very quick dead ends with biological reproduction. That's true in the animal kingdom. That's extremely true in the plant kingdom also. So it's very hard to take corn and wheat and have corn wheat. It's very hard to take barley and corn and have bar corn. It won't reproduce. The pollen won't cause it to reproduce. You can stay within the corn family or the barley family or the soybean family or the horse family with mules and horses, but the offspring, the donkey, is sterile. So there's dead-end streets all the time. So Genesis doesn't necessarily rule out some of this, quote, Darwinian evolution potential, but it does say that God actually created these after their kind very distinct. And there's no insinuation in Genesis chapter 1 that he created cows and then cows evolved into horses. There's no sense of that in Genesis. God is the one that created, and it doesn't imply any process. It doesn't imply long periods of time. It doesn't even imply any time. God created, very distinct, very quick, very abrupt. And he created very distinct after their kind, after their kind, after their kind. So some people will say, read into it, and they'll say, well, yeah, God created after kind, but then evolutionary process kicked in. And that gets us right back to the original discussion. Is Darwinian evolution actually true? Is it scientifically verifiable? Is it a good theory? So back to the theistic evolution. So we have full-blown Darwinian evolution. We have punctuated equilibrium evolutionists. We have theistic evolutionists. And then we got intelligent design. So, unfortunately, lots of Christians in the sciences actually still embrace theistic evolution. Possibly a variety of reasons. I think some of the motivation, in some cases, is tremendous pressure from academic community that is in control of the scientific structures of America. So, like the film, Expelled. If you don't buy Darwinian evolution, it's probably better for your health and your academic career not to tell anybody. Because if you start publicizing that you actually don't believe it or you believe in intelligent design, your career could be in serious jeopardy. So, I'm trying to think of his first name, Gudimario, the guy that's at Iowa State that wrote the book, The Privileged Planet. He was denied tenure at Iowa State. He suspects, and others suspect, that it was probably because of his views on intelligent design. He's a world-class scientist in his area. He's not you know, in the top half of his class. He's up on the top of his discipline. And so Ben Stein, the word in the movie Expelled, if you buck Darwinian evolution, you might be out of a job under the guise of, well, you're not really academic, you're not really professional, you're really not a scholar. I quite frankly think in the next 30 years that Darwinian evolution is going to go down the toilet. The level of scientific information that we're going to find out in the next 30 years is going to literally bury Darwinian evolution in the ground. It's going to bury it. It's going to be dead. And it'll be comical, you know, as we look back 30 years from now, people say, oh man, can you believe that? Scientists actually believe it. Well, I didn't believe it, you know, I don't believe it. You know, nobody's going to want to actually agree to believe in it. You know, you get this with different issues, you know, the racism issue in America during the 50s and 60s, you know, and, you know, there's people that are still alive that were fighting for racial segregation, and they were racists. Will they stand up today and say, oh, well, you know, I was really a full-blown racist, you know? Well, no, they're not going to say that. Why? It's not popular to say it anymore. So there's nobody ever in America now, you know, that's a racist or ever was a racist, you know, because it's not popular to identify with that position. People are going to distance themselves from that particular perspective. You know, they're still running around in America. I think that's going to be the same thing 30 years from now with Darwin. Oh, I didn't believe it. You know, I taught at a secular university. You know, I had to teach evolution, but, you know, I really didn't personally believe it. I may not be alive when that happens. I hope I am. Because I think Darwinian evolution is bad science, horrible philosophy. If you want to believe it, it's a free country. But I don't think it's scientifically good. Number 5, the evidence for intelligent design. Dr. Walter Bradley, co-author of the book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, he wrote that with a guy by the name of Dr. Thaxton. It's actually an old book. It came out kind of in response to the new data with this biochemical predestination. In fact, actually, there's a book endorsement by Dean Kenyon on it. So it's probably after Dean Kenyon found out that his biochemical predestination ain't going to work. And Bradley and Thaxton wrote this book. It was pretty significant. And a quote from it, each cell in the human body contains more information than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's certainly reasonable to make the inference that this isn't the random product of unguided nature, but it's the unmistakable sign of an intelligent designer. Did the 30 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica come about by wind and erosion? Monkeys in a room with computer keyboards and a truckload of bananas? And quite frankly, the monkeys actually have a fairly significant level of intelligence. But when they put them in a room for 3 months with bananas and computer keyboards, they couldn't even produce one word in the English vocabulary. Smallest word in the English vocabulary is space, a space. They did not, in 3 months of pounding on those keyboards, ever even produce the word a. And you think unintelligent randomness is going to produce the 30 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica? I cannot understand this insanity. Number 6, the icons of evolution. 10 questions to ask your biology teacher. This is a book written by Jonathan Wells, The Icons of Evolution. These are the 10 greatest evidences to support Darwinian evolution. Jonathan Wells, who's not a Christian, he's got a PhD in biology and a PhD in embryology from Berkeley. He says all 10 of them are false. So the 10 greatest evidences for Darwinian evolution, all 10 of them are false. And these are the ones they give you to support Darwinian evolution. Is this good science? I think not. Origin of life, Miller-Urey experiment. We already talked that somewhat to death. Did not accurately stimulate the Earth's early atmosphere, and it does not help explain the origin of life. There's no relationship to it. You got 2 amino acids that are not used in the formation of life. So I don't know what the connection is. Why do textbooks claim that the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment shows how life's building blocks have formed on the early Earth when conditions on the early Earth were nothing like those used in the experiment, and the origin of life remains a mystery scientifically? 2, Darwin's tree of life. Darwin's universal tree of life is inconsistent with the fossil record of the Cambrian explosion and with the recent molecular evidence. Why don't textbooks discuss the Cambrian explosion, in which all major animal groups appear together in the fossil record, fully formed, instead of branching from a common ancestor, thus contradicting the evolutionary tree of life? So the Cambrian strata is either the second or third level of the fossil record, and it's very early on in the history of early Earth. And in the Cambrian explosion, so the lower thing, you got hydras and amoebas and simple plant life, single-celled plants. And the next level, you got invertebrates, vertebrates, fish, lung creatures. You got the whole full-blown strata of animal existence, from plankton and amoebas to chipmunks and squirrels and birds and reptiles and ducks and fish. You got the whole strata exploding all at the same time, which says they lived at the same time. Clearly it says they lived at the same time, or within the same time period in the formation of Earth. So it says that there was not this gradual evolution from an amoeba and then a hydra, and then you get bacterium, and then you get whatever's next on the chain. A little bit more complex, a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex. It doesn't happen. You get it all blown together at the Cambrian explosion. Cambrian explosion is an embarrassment to paleontologists, people that study fossils. It's an embarrassment. Why don't they discuss it? Why don't they put it in the textbooks? Well, because they know Darwinian evolution is a scientific fact. They don't want to confuse us with the data. I think it's dishonest. I think it's dishonest. Share all the evidence. If you're in the courtroom, let everybody present their evidence. Let the jury make its decision. So in 1926, there was the Scopes 1 trial, where a high school biology teacher wanted to teach evolutionary theory. It was not allowed. So he got himself arrested, and the American Civil Liberties Union, which ought to be named the Non-American, Non-Civil, Non-Liberties Union, defended that high school biology teacher. William Jennings Bryant, who is a very outspoken, prestigious pastor and Christian spokesman, defended a creationist, what would be called a creationist viewpoint at that particular trial. And the American Civil Liberties Union lawyer argued that it was narrow-minded to teach only one view of origins, that all views of origins that existed should be taught side by side, and let the students make their own decision. So it's wrong to have simply creationism taught without the other potential theory of Darwinian evolution. The evolutionists lost the court case, but won the battle. There's a fairly famous film entitled Inherit the Wind that is an incredibly good, I don't mean good in a moral sense, I mean good in an effective sense, a very aggressive propaganda piece for Darwinian evolution. It jams evolution down your throat with the movie. It's very well done, but it's a piece of propaganda. Inherit the Wind. And Philip Johnson talks about it in the book, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. So the creationists won the court case, but they actually lost the battle. And eventually, Darwinian evolution was allowed into the school system to be taught. In 1980, there was another court case that was branded the Scopes II trial. And in Arkansas, some individuals that were highly respected scientists and theologians argued that it is wrong to teach only one view of origins. That intelligent design, which is not a religious theory, it's a scientific theory, should be taught alongside of evolution. The American Civil Liberties Union represented the opposition to that idea. And the American Civil Liberties Union lawyer argued that it's arrogant and egotistical to teach two views of origins. Only one view of origins should be taught in the public schools of America. Darwinian evolution only. And they won the case. 1926, they said it was arrogant to teach only one view. In 1980, they said it was arrogant to teach two views. And they won both times. So much for justice. So much for justice. Thank you, American Civil Liberties Union. The two guys that started the organization were members of the Communist Party. I highly doubt that they were overly supportive of American democracy as two card-carrying communists. Now, I'm not inferring that anybody that's presently a member of the American Civil Liberties Union is a communist. I'm not inferring that, but I'm saying the foundation of it, they weren't actually all that pro-American, at least not pro-democracy. So the evolutionists will play any side of the street sometimes in order to gain their verdict. I don't think that's scientific. I don't think it's fair. But hey, we're in the marketplace of ideas. We continue to discuss. So, number 3, homology. If homology is defined as similarity due to common ancestry, it cannot be used as evidence for common ancestry. Its causes are unknown. So, it's kind of a circular argument. How do we know that these things are linked together as ancestors? Well, because they look similar. Why do they look similar? Because they are common ancestors. You haven't proven anything. You've assumed both ends of it. You've assumed your conclusion and your premise. You haven't proven a darn thing. Number 4, vertebrate embryos. Ernest Haeckel made some drawings of various various vertebrates in their embryonic stages. So in their first, say, 2-3 weeks of life, what do these embryos look like? And so he drew pictures with them. And they were put in textbooks. And as scientists are well aware of now, and Jonathan Wells points out in his book, Icons of Evolution, the photographs or the drawings are actually forged. They're false. He didn't actually observe various vertebrate embryos and observe them and take pictures of them or sketch them as they appeared. He invented the drawings. And even if embryos, vertebrate embryos in their early stages of development look similar, the only thing it proves, at least on the surface, is they look similar. Simply because they look similar does not necessarily mean that there's an ancestral or an evolutionary development connection. That's assuming far too much. And Jonathan Wells, who, by the way, does have a PhD in embryology, critiques Haeckel's drawings and calls them on the carpet and says they're forged. And actually, the actual evidence is vertebrate embryos actually are significantly dissimilar in their appearance at the early stages. Well, what does he know? Well, he's actually got a PhD from Berkeley in embryology, so he actually does know, doesn't he? He didn't get a mail-order PhD. He's actually a scholar in his area, and he's not a Christian. That doesn't discount his opinion if he were, but he's qualified to make the comment. He's highly competent. So why do textbooks use drawings of similarities in vertebrate embryos as evidence for their common ancestry, even though biologists have known for over a century that vertebrate embryos are not most similar in their early stages? And they know the drawings are faked. Why do they still use them? Why are they still in the textbooks? Well, because it represents the scientific or the scientific reality of evolution. It's like Philip Johnson says, you better turn on your baloney detector because there's a lot of baloney in this, quote, scientific theory of evolution. And it doesn't stand up to investigation. Archaeopteryx, the supposed dinosaur ancestors of Archaeopteryx appear long after it when modern birds are probably not descended from it. Why do textbooks portray this fossil as the missing link between dinosaurs and modern birds, even though modern birds are probably not descended from it? And its supposed ancestors do not appear until 75 million years after it. Yeah, good science. Peppered moths. Peppered moths do not rest on tree trunks in the wild. Ketwell's experiments were flawed in the photos, some of the photos by future investigators were staged. So Ketwell wanted to see if there's effects on the white moth in Great Britain during the coal revolution. So industrialization, they started using and burning a lot of coal. There was, dust and soot from that, and that black soot began to fall on the countryside around these factories. And so he thought that this might affect the survival rate of moths. So he began to actually capture moths, white moths, and he would release them during the daytime, and he would try to watch them with binoculars and see what happened to them and how often they got eaten. He would release white moths, he would release black moths, and he would see how many of them got eaten in a certain amount of time by birds. Some of his follow-up guys that continue to, quote, do research, you're going to find it hard to believe, I know, but you can read it in Jonathan Wells' book. Some future researchers actually took the peppered moth, the white moth, dyed them black, glued them on tree trunks, and photographed them as, quote, scientific evidence for these moths landing on tree trunks and therefore becoming bird food much easier. When do birds feed and fly? When do sparrows and robins, when do they fly? What time of the day? During the daytime. When do moths fly? At night. You're going to have a hard time getting birds to eat moths when they're not around the same time. Birds feed and fly during the daytime, moths fly and feed at nighttime. So Ketwell's experiment was actually deeply flawed. Moths don't fly around in the daytime. They don't land on tree trunks. And some of the experimental data was actually forged, not by Ketwell, but actually future, quote, scientists actually forged the data by actually spray painting the moths, gluing them to tree trunks, and photographing them as evidence. Still in the textbooks. Still in the textbooks as scientific evidence for evolution. Man, great science, great science. Darwin's finches. These finches did not inspire Darwin with the idea of evolution, and natural selection on their beaks produced no long-term change. So they went from 9 to 13 species back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Why do textbooks claim that beak changes in the Galapagos finches during a severe drought can explain the origin of species by natural selection, even though the changes were reversed after the drought ended and no net change, evolutionary speaking, happened? Went back to the 13 species, 9 to 13, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Never jumped to a new species. You never got species number 14. Why is it in the textbooks? Mutant fruit flies. 4-winged fruit flies must be artificially bred, and their extra wings are useless. They have no muscles attached to the extra set of wings. These mutations are not raw materials for evolution. Why do textbooks use fruit flies with an extra pair of wings as evidence that DNA mutations can supply the raw materials for evolution, even though the extra wings have no muscles and these disabled mutants cannot survive outside the laboratory? Genetic changes adaptation of the particular organism in question has to confer a functional advantage on the organism, like the ability to survive, to fight, to reproduce more productively, to run. These fruit flies can't survive outside the laboratory environment. So these mutations do not confer a functional advantage on the organism. But they have it in the textbooks. Look at what evolution can do. This fruit fly's got 2 sets of wings. Isn't that exciting, the development that evolution can do? Question, do the wings work? No. Do they have muscles attached to the wings? No. Do that extra set of useless wings confer any functional advantage on the survival of the fruit fly? No. In fact, actually, it's detrimental for its survival. It's got more body weight, but it doesn't have any function. But it's in the textbooks as evidence for evolution. Come on. Come on. This is craziness. And this is heralded as science? Horse evolution. Evidence from fossil horses does not justify the claim that evolution was undirected, which is a philosophical rather than an empirical scientific statement. So you see 2 different horse fossils. Oh, so-and-so developed into so-and-so. Did you interview him? How do you know that? I mean, literally, how do you know that? You don't. You're making an assumption. Human origins. The subject of human origins is very controversial, and most claims rest on little evidence, like drawings of ancestors, which are actually hypothetical, sometimes actually forged and fake. Why are the artist's drawings of ape-like humans used to justify materialistic claims that we are just animals and our existence is a mere accident, especially when fossil experts cannot even agree on who our supposed ancestors were or what they looked like? So, in some of the textbooks, they probably took them out by now, I don't know, but the Nebraska man. So they found a jawbone, and from that jawbone they constructed a particular looking pre-Homo sapien type of creature, kind of like a caveman. They had drawings of them in the newspaper, Mr. and Mrs. Nebraska man, full-blown pictures of their entire skeletal, structure and how they looked, flesh, I mean like a human being would look. Pictures of this, drawings. Then they found out the jawbone was from a modern-day pig. Wasn't humanoid at all. It was from a pig, a domestic pig. But they inflated this thing like crazy into full drawings of Mr. and Mrs. Nebraska. This, could find another number of sources. I actually read the book, The Face of Evolution. And he talks about all these crazy statements that people make. So we got all these claims. Half of them don't stand up. Some strategies, letter G. Strategies to challenge Darwinian evolution. Number 1, this is kind of from Philip Johnson's Refuting Darwinism. Distinguish between what scientists assume and what scientists investigate. Scientists assume far more than they can investigate. So they assume that adaptation of the Galapagos finches proves speciation, or Archaeopteryx, or vestal fins with whales, or fruit fly mutation. These are gigantic assumptions. And there's really, I don't see any scientific data, strong scientific data, to support any of these conclusions. Can scientists investigate the material world? Yes. Can they investigate living organisms? Yes. Can they observe fossils? Yes. So they can investigate those things. We have to limit our conclusions because our conclusions may not be supported by the data. So Johnson rightfully says, distinguish between what scientists assume, and they assume too much, and what they actually can investigate. Can you investigate whether or not ivory soap floats or water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 atmosphere pressure, when it's pure water, or an acid-base reaction produces a salt in water? Yes, you can investigate those things, because you can repeat those things over and over and over and over again, and you can observe the data, and you can verify your hypothesis or your theory. But assuming that this fossil evolved into this fossil, that's a gigantic assumption. And you cannot prove it. And you cannot investigate it other than digging up fossils. But I don't know how in the world, even if they were connected, that you could, quote, scientifically prove it. I don't see how it's possible unless you could observe it. Number 2, use terms precisely and consistently. There's a strong difference between microevolution, which I don't think is actually evolution. I think it's actually adaptation. And I don't like to use the word microevolution when I talk about adaptation. Because what happens is, evolutionists will use microevolution. They'll say, well, you know, microevolution is a fact. I agree. But then they'll switch the definition of evolution from microevolution to macroevolution, but they use the exact same word. So they'll use the word evolution to describe adaptation. And then they'll use the same word evolution as they're describing speciation. And they'll say, well, you know, we know that microevolution is true. Okay, so evolution is true, but now it's been defined as microevolution. And then later they'll use that same word, but they'll apply it to speciation. They'll say, well, evolution is true. And I'll say, well, it depends upon what evolution you're talking about. Are you talking about micro or macroevolution? Or are you talking about adaptation or speciation? So it confuses the issue too much. And they basically use the term defined two different ways in the discussion, which confuses the issue. So that's why I'm a little bit resistant to the microevolution term. I'd rather use the more, I think, more accurate label of adaptation, because it's not inferring speciation. It's saying within a species, a particular organism in case, like the finches, or an animal that develops greater levels of fat tissue because they're in a cold climate. I have nothing against adaptation. I agree, we observe it all the time, and it's observable scientifically. But adaptation is not macroevolution. Microevolution is simply the cyclical variations or adaptations within a specific species, while macroevolution is a long-term process that creates new and more complex species. That's a very different thing. Distinguish between microevolution, adaptation, and macroevolution, speciation. Micro involves adaptation within a species, like the finch beaks. Everyone agrees here. Macro involves one species going to a different species, fish becoming frogs. Give me the evidence. Adaptation is neither macroevolution nor does it necessarily imply it. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. Every time I ask an evolution for proof, they cite the peppered moth and Darwin's finches. Give me proof for macroevolution. Peppered moth, Darwin's finches, I'll say. Bro, that's adaptation. Oh yeah, but you know, that's proof for macroevolution. No, it's not. There's no necessary connection. There's no necessary connection between adaptation and speciation. There's no connection between the two. But they infer it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you infer it because I don't think it's true. 3, keep an eye on the mechanism of evolution. What caused this pattern of similarity? I was at UCR, I was given a lecture, I forget what it was on. I don't know, I don't remember. But we got into the discussion of intelligent design, Darwinian evolution. I had a student, I think he was maybe a sophomore. He's actually from Russia. And he asked me a question about Darwinian evolution. And he basically said, you know, we see such similarity between, like, you know, monkeys and chimpanzees and orangutans and baboons and humans. We see so much similarity. Doesn't that suggest to you, John, that we descended from a chain of events, from evolution, that we're all common ancestors? Doesn't that show that to you? Are you surprised that the Acura car is similar to the Honda Accord? Are you surprised that the Civic is very similar to the Accord or the Prelude? Does that surprise you at all? Does it surprise you that every painting by Thomas Kincaid looks somewhat the same? The painter of light. Does that surprise you? Does it surprise you that the Silverado truck is similar to the S10 Chevy pickup? Does it surprise you? Shouldn't surprise you, it's made by the same company. Thomas Kincaid's, all of his paintings are painted by the same painter. Acura and Honda are the same company. Lexus and Toyota are the same company. Lexus is produced by Toyota. Does it surprise you that Lexuses are similar to Toyotas? No, it doesn't surprise me at all. Why? Because the same manufacturer makes them both. So there's another possible alternative for why there's similarity between the monkey and the chimpanzee and the orangutan and the baboon and the human being. They're all made by the same creator. Does that surprise you that there's similarities when they're made by the same manufacturer? Why is my answer less descriptive and plausible than your answer? Is my answer not plausible? What's easier? A tornado to produce Lexus and Toyota? Or auto manufacturing engineers to produce them? What's easier? What's easier to produce new species? Intelligent, powerful creator, or an impersonal, materialistic process? What's easier to accomplish the feat? So I think my answer of a divine creator that created all these species, I think it's actually more plausible. It's more pleasing, not because I believe in God, but because I think it's more plausible that it's easier to get different species within an infinitely powerful creator versus wind and erosion and a mindless, impersonal, unsupervised natural process by a chance environment and historical contingencies, evolution. My thing is much more plausible, I think. Much more plausible. So why do you discount mine and you go for the more difficult viewpoint? You're predisposed. You're predisposed. You're going to rule out my viewpoint before you even examine the data. It's not very scientific, is it? It's not very philosophically honest, is it? I'm willing to consider Darwinian evolution. I have for most of my life. I just think it's false. So keep an eye on the mechanism of evolution. What caused the pattern of similarity? Push for identification of the mechanism and the means for evolution. They'll never give you a mechanism. They speak in philosophical platitudes. Well, genetic modification. Okay. So show me how you can get from the Gettysburg Address to the Encyclopedia Britannica with no human involvement. You just cut up the letters of the Gettysburg Address, you photocopy all the letters, and you throw it up in the air, and you get the Encyclopedia Britannica. Give me an explanation. So you go from an amoeba to a fish, or from a fish to a duck. How did you get the 100 million times more genetic information? Where did you get it? Where'd you get it? How did you get from the Gettysburg Address to the Encyclopedia Britannica? How did you get it? You don't have any human individuals. You don't have any intelligent mind. How did you get the additional 100 million times more genetic information? Where did you get it from? Give me an answer. Genetic modification. Sweet. That's really quick. That's cute. That's cute. It's a platitude. Give me the details. How did you get from the Gettysburg Address to Encyclopedia Britannica? How did you get from the amoeba to the fish? How did you get from the fish to the lizard or the duck or the turtle? How did you get from point A to point B? Give me the mechanism. Do they have a mechanism? No, they don't have a mechanism. They speak in philosophical platitudes. Genetic modification. I'm sick and tired of that answer, quite frankly. I'm sick of it. When I hear it, I'm like, shut up. You're giving me a non-answer. You're not even giving me an answer. It's not an answer. It's a philosophical assumption that has very little scientific content to it. Information is not a material substance, remember? Information is not a material substance. All science has with the organism, by their definition, is material substance. So where do you get the new information? You can't get it from material substance because material substance is not information. Information is not a physical thing. Information only comes from a mind. So where is the amoeba going to get the Encyclopedia Britannica when it only's got the Gettysburg Address? Where is it going to get it? Can't get it from genes. Can't get it from protons or electrons because information is not physical substance. Where are you going to get the new information? Where are you going to get it? I think these are insurmountable problems. I don't think they have an answer to it, other than these just natural selection. I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay, fine. When they say mutation and natural selection, they're given a philosophical paradigm, not scientific data. How does a particular mutation result in a new system? Give me the specific mechanism. How do I go from a 3-chambered heart to a 4-chambered heart? How do I go from gills to lungs? I want to know the specific genetic modifications, step by step by step by step. And where you get the new genetic information, I want to know. Philip Johnson never gets an answer to the question. He's debated every PhD, lots of PhD guys in the area of biology and genetics. He's never gotten an answer to the question other than this philosophical platitude. It's actually a book, it's actually a debate format with a Darwinian evolutionist, Philip Johnson. They debate, it's the record of the debate, and then they ask each other questions. And they answer each other's questions. So that would be a good book that you can get both perspectives from people that are in the know on this particular issue. They go back and forth. I forget the title of it, but it's Philip Johnson didn't write it, somebody else did, an editor, but it's Philip Johnson and an evolutionary Darwinian evolutionist that are dialoguing the book. So that, if you want to get it from both sides, that would be a good book to do it. Philip Johnson, evolution doesn't have much scientific content without a testable mechanism for changing one kind of creature into something entirely different. So I have some data, which some of this was not in your notes, but this this isn't in your notes either. Okay, let's see. Problems with methodological naturalism. Here's some problems. This is not in your notes. Problems with methodological naturalism. First one, it has an anti-supernatural I'm going to give you a mouthful here philosophically. In my opinion, it has got an anti-supernatural, a priori presuppositional bias. A priori presuppositional bias. Anti-supernatural. If it involves a discussion about God or supernatural intervention, we're going to rule it out. Second, a priori means you decide something prior to examining the evidence. So if I say Ben is taller than Diana, but I'm taller than Ben, then I can infer without measuring anybody that I'm actually taller than Diana. I don't have to examine the evidence to get the measuring rule out. I can know prior to examining the evidence. If it's wrong to lie, and I lied, then it's wrong that I lied. I don't have to examine the evidence. So I can know certain things prior to examining the evidence. So a priori is a particular way we understand or we can know truth or knowledge. So I think methodological naturalism actually makes a decision about this prior to examining the evidence. They rule it out. So it's anti-supernatural, a priori presuppositional bias it has. Well, that's at least my opinion. It's either religious, and I use that in a qualified way. It's either religious or worldview, dogma, masquerading as science. It's either religious or worldview dogma. So it's either religious dogma. Now, by religious, I don't mean God, Jesus, Christianity. I mean things that are held very strongly, and it's a part of your worldview. Everybody's got a worldview. Atheists have worldviews. Agnostics have worldview. Everybody's got a worldview. Simply because your worldview doesn't use the word God doesn't mean your worldview is not religious. Because there's some things people hold on to, period, irregardless of whatever, they'll hold the view. So it's either religious dogma or worldview dogma. So they're going to hold this no matter what. So if you give them evidence that it's false, they're not going to give it up. A good scientist will give up the theory if the data doesn't support it. So if a scientist doesn't give up the theory when the data doesn't support it, in fact, the data disproves it, and he doesn't give it up, I don't think his viewpoint can be categorized as science. His viewpoint has to be some type of adherence irregardless of the evidence. That's a worldview dogma. We get that with people who don't believe there's any truth, like on the worldview surveys. Is there any absolute truth? Is there any universal truth? No. Is that true for everybody? Yes. So it's universally true that there is no truth. That's correct. Which, of course, they've contradicted themselves. But they're not going to give it up. And you saw this with some of the people you interviewed. Is racism wrong? Yes. Is it wrong for everybody? Yes. Is it wrong to judge people? Yes. Should you judge the racist? No. Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Something's wrong with your worldview here. There's contradiction. Oh, it's okay if it's contradictory. It can be true if it's contradictory. It's craziness. So they'll continue to assert their position even though, number one, they know it's not coherent, and two, they probably know it's not even true. But they continue to assert that it's true. That's not logic. That's not good philosophy. This is not good science. But it masquerades as science. It's not science. The data doesn't support it. It's not a good scientific theory. You ought to get rid of it. But they say that it's science. I disagree. Thirdly, methodological naturalism is not scientifically testable. It's not scientifically testable. Since it's not observable. If evolution were, Darwinian evolution were true, you can't observe it because it happens over hundreds of millions of years. During our lifetime, if we sit there and watch the amoeba for 100 years, sorry, there's not going to be enough genetic changes for you to even observe it. It's going to be too small of changes, and the amoeba is going to stay an amoeba. So it's got a genetic modification. It's still an amoeba. So you cannot observe it even if it were true, and I don't think it is. And fourthly, empirical evidence doesn't support it. Fossil record doesn't support it. DNA doesn't support it. Dead ends with reproduction, whether it's in the plant community or the animal community, it just doesn't support Darwinian. It doesn't support it. No intermediate fossils. It just doesn't support it. Yeah, but we know it's true. Oh, golly.
So what do you think the Darwinian evolutionists' main motivation is behind still accepting Darwinian evolution, even though the way that the evidence is obviously against it?
I think it's against it. It's definitely part of that, and I think there's fear. So sometimes you'll get, when you interview the guy publicly, he totes Darwinian evolution. But if you get him one-on-one and he's off camera and he says, "Will you promise me not to tell anybody what I think?" Yes. I think evolution sucks. I think it's false. But don't quote me because I'll lose my job. So that's part of the fear, and then part of it is this paradigm that they really are convinced it's the only way to do science. They're really convinced. The only way to do science is by methodological naturalism. And I just think they're duped. And in the history of science, this is not true in the history of science. So you look over the history of science for the last 1,000 years, that paradigm isn't true. Methodological naturalism is a fairly recent paradigm to do science. So how do we do science before Darwinian evolution or before methodological naturalism? There was a different paradigm. So when they make this point, kind of like this is the only way to do science, quite frankly, they're not understanding the history of science. They're really not. And there's a lot of books written on the history of science by guys that are Christian and non-Christian. PhDs, their whole area is just the history of science. I took a whole course. J.P. Moreland teaches a course, used to teach a course on the history of science and the philosophy of science. He's got a textbook that he wrote on it called Christianity and the History of Science. So as you look at the history of science, methodological naturalism is not the only game that's been around. But currently in our culture, this is the God to be worshipped. And if you question that the emperor doesn't have clothes on, you're wailed on. So you got the old story with the emperor that makes these imaginary clothes, and he goes parading down the street naked, but everybody's told to believe he's got clothes. So everybody acknowledges, oh man, his clothes are wonderful, they're beautiful, they're so colorful, they're so gorgeous. And then this young little kid that doesn't know better says, how come the king is naked? And the fantasy's over with because somebody actually observed in an honest way what reality really is. So there's tremendous pressure in our culture today. Fear of getting fired, and this paradigm that they think it's the only way to do science. It's not the only way to do science, but it's going to take a little bit more push and tug in order to have changes in it, and who knows when that will happen. I'm not sure when it will happen, but I hope in my lifetime. I don't know if you got to it in your textbook reading yet. Okay. Two other things dealing with strategies to deal with Darwinian evolution. Philip Johnson says we need to differentiate the difference between using a theory against evidence or using selective evidence. He says you have to be careful. Then he says learn the difference between intelligent and unintelligent causes. And he gives two examples by evolutionists in your book. Where did I put it? Okay. I think it's page 62 in your textbook, Refuting Darwinism. He quotes Professor Tim Berra, who's a zoologist, teaches, I think, at Ohio State University. He wrote the book entitled Evolution, the Myth of Creationism. Oh, excuse me, Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. I wonder what his viewpoint is. What do you think his viewpoint is by the book title? Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. Well, you know where he stands. So here's his comment. Everything evolves in the sense of descent with modification. Now he's using a buzz phrase that links you up with Darwinian evolution, this phraseology, descent with modification. Everything evolves in the sense of descent with modification. Now listen to his examples. Whether it be government policy, religion, sports cars, or organisms. Now he's using an argument by analogy. Two different arguments here maybe. Generalization, he's piling up examples, but then really the argument is an analogy argument. So organisms evolve, and he's saying organisms evolve just like government policy evolves. Religion evolves. Sports cars evolve, okay? So now he's going to develop a sports car. The revolutionary fiberglass Corvette evolved from more mundane automotive ancestors. So now he's using another buzzword, ancestors, in 1953. Other high points in the Corvette's evolutionary refinement included the 1962 model. Today's version continues the stepwise refinements that have been accumulating since 1953. He's using all kinds of buzzwords. The point is that the Corvette evolved through a selection process, acting on variations that resulted in a series of transitional forms and an endpoint rather distinct from the starting point. Par excellence. Crappy logic. Terrible philosophy. But very persuasive to the unknowing mind. A similar process shapes the evolution of organisms. Is it a fair analogy? Evolutionary refinements of the Corvette. What was involved in the evolutionary refinements of the Corvette car? What was involved in it? Intelligence. Now, we could argue whether government policy has any intelligence involved in it. Religion seems to have a little bit sometimes. Sports cars have a lot more intelligence involved in it. Modern-day Corvette has got like 4 onboard computers, modifies air temperature and airflow into the engine something like 200 times a second. That happened by chance? Golly. Your credulity pushes my insanity. So this is a dissimilar analogy. Corvette car has massive amounts of intelligence associated with it. Is government policy a living thing? Is it alive? Does it have cells, blood, bone structure, organs? No. Does religion? Is it a physical object? No. Cars, is it a physical object? Yes. Is it a living organism? No. Dissimilar analogies. Dissimilar examples. Well, he thinks, par excellence. Oh, look at this example. Proves evolution. Actually, it actually is an argument against evolution, actually. He just doesn't know it. Philip Johnson says, what biologists present as proof of evolution or common ancestry is just as likely to be evidence of common design. Microbiologist Francis Crick argues in a similar fashion. If you doubt the power of natural selection, I urge you to save your soul. He doesn't believe in a soul, but he wants you to save your soul. To read Richard Dawkins' book. I think you'll find it a revelation. Oh, wow, revelation. Revelation from who? Dawkins gives a nice argument to show how far the process of evolution can go in the time available to it. He points out that man, by selection, has produced an enormous variety of types of dogs, such as Pekingese and bulldogs and so on, in the space of only a few thousand years. Here, man is the important factor in the environment, and it is his peculiar tastes that have produced by selective breeding, not by design. Manipulation of terms and ideas, manipulation par excellence. The freaks of nature we see preserved all around us as domestic dogs. Yet the time required to do this on an evolutionary scale of hundreds of millions of years is extraordinarily short. So we should not be surprised at the ever greater variety of creatures that natural selection has produced on this much larger time scale. Selective breeding of dogs. Who is involved in this? Wind and erosion? Naturalistic processes? No. Human beings, intelligent sources. What did the breeding of dogs produce anyway? Dogs. Oh my heaven, this is proof of evolution. I mean, you bred dogs and you got dogs. That's proof of evolution. It's proof of macroevolution. It's proof of speciation. Darwin has been proven. When we breed dogs, we get dogs. Yes! You expect me to believe this stuff? How dumb do you think I am? I don't see how they can expect me to believe this stuff. You breed dogs and you get dogs. Show me an example where you breed dogs and you get horses. Show me speciation. Quit showing me adaptation, because adaptation means macroevolution. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Where is that written? What holy grail did that descend from? What heaven? I don't get it. Philip Johnson says, selective breeding is not the same thing as natural selection, or even analogous to it. It is intelligent design. Philip Johnson was a Berkeley law professor. He actually clerked, I think, for Warren Burger. You have to be pretty darn sharp to be a law clerk for a Supreme Court justice. Philip Johnson is not dumb. He's actually incredibly smart. And generally, lawyers are pretty good at dismantling or building arguments. I had lunch yesterday with a judge, a bankruptcy judge, good friend of mine. I've mentioned about him in the past. He is incredibly good at logical thinking. He can pick a good argument or a bad argument a million miles away. It's one of the reasons why I like him as a friend and we get along so well, because we'll have discussions and he is so good in his thinking. Philip Johnson is a highly accomplished lawyer. He is very good at dismantling and evaluating arguments, and he can see that this argument related to evolution is a bad argument. That's why he wrote the book Darwin on Trial. And then later on he wrote the high school version of it, which is the one I have you read, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. So I don't think Darwinian evolution is very good science. Quite frankly, I think it's even worse philosophy. I take great issue with it. I stand by my original comments to my evolutionary biologist individual that I met, but I am more than happy to entertain scientific evidence or philosophical evidence or any other type of evidence that's credible evidence to support the theory. I'm not going to rule it out simply because I don't necessarily like it. That's not why I rule it out. I rule it out because I think it's bad science and because it's horrible, horrible philosophy. But unfortunately, it's going to be with us for a little bit more length of time. Questions on Darwinian evolution or comments before we take a turn and start our discussion about the problem of evil, which includes Darwinian evolution.
So you think in 30 years that Darwinian evolution is going to be gone as a scientific theory?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that going to eliminate any atheistic scientists, or were they going to say about the origin?
You're always going to have pockets of people that are going to hold on to the theory, so it's not going to totally eliminate completely Darwinian evolution. But I'm hoping and I think that Darwinian evolution will be not the biggest thing in vogue. It'll still exist. There'll be still professors that teach it, adhere to it, think everybody else is psycho and crazy. But I think that it's going to be shown that it's not scientific and it's not as credible as it claims to be. So I think it's going to move from the majority paradigm to a very minority paradigm. But, you know, time will tell. My prediction could be totally off, but we'll see with time. But that's kind of how I sense it. But, you know, my life is not dependent on it happening.
Will intelligent design then become what fills its place? Like,
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Are things at least that there's an intelligent creator and how far people move towards the intelligent design paradigm. Yeah, I think it will be intelligent design, and there's people that you know, don't have strong religious convictions like David Berlinski. He actually, I think, works with the Discovery Institute, and so he's a part of this project of intelligent design. He's Jewish in background, and I think he believes in God, but he doesn't have a deep, I don't think, by my understanding, I don't think he has a deep religious conviction. He's definitely not a Christian, but he thinks intelligent design is just, you know, a no-brainer. And, you know, he's not a run-of-the-mill type of philosopher or intellectual. He's pretty high level and very, very brilliant. So I think intelligent design will replace it. But you're going to have people from a broad spectrum of worldview and religious disposition, some that'll kind of, you know, acknowledge that there's some type of creator, but that's about as far as they're going to go with it. And Darwinian evolution will probably always exist to some extent, but I really think that the scientific evidence is going to make it almost implausible, and it's going to make it almost embarrassing to scientists to continue to hold on to Darwinian evolution. Be like holding on that, you know, the Earth is the center of the solar system. It's going to just be, you know, it's not going to be very in vogue, and nor is it going to be a viewpoint that's going to be sustainable by the evidence. If you still want to believe the Earth is the center of the solar system, it's a free country, be my guest. I just don't think you're going to be able to hold it intellectually.
Do you think then the pendulum will swing back to Christian theism, or will it just swing back to maybe a New Age spirituality?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think the verdict is actually substantially out in American culture. I know that cosmology has moved cosmologists strongly towards theism, and then it's been a very short distance for a lot of them from theism to Christianity. So Hugh Ross, in his book, I think it's The Fingerprint of God, quotes, he doesn't name the guy, but he says he's at San Diego State. He says there's, you know, one of the cosmologists at San Diego State that's an atheist says, I'm getting sick and tired of all of my colleagues joining the First Church of Jesus Christ of the Big Bang. And he's ticked off. He's an atheist, but he sees all of his contemporaries that are professors looking at cosmology, becoming theists, and then after become theists, they're becoming committed Christians. And he's hacked off about it. And so here's this kind of reactionary comment, which is very entertaining to me as a believer. You know, all of my colleagues are joining the Church of Jesus Christ of the Big Bang, you know? So cosmology is pushing people in that direction of theism and then Christianity, and the same potential exists with intelligent design. There's a God that made this world, and Christianity has got consistent answers related to that creator. There's only 3 religions that are in the running, I think, based upon cosmology. It's got to be theism, because God existed prior to the universe. And God's not a part of the universe since he existed independently and ontologically prior to the universe. So Hinduism and Buddhism are out. Taoism is out. Confucianism, which is really technically not a religion, is out, even though they all of them have some good moral teaching to it. So we only have Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I think Christianity is Judeo-Christianity. So my only argument is with Islam, and now our discussion gets different with issues like, is Jesus God? Did Jesus die on the cross? Did Jesus rise from the grave? Is Christianity true as Islam? They both can't be true. So it gets us down to theism, and it gets us mighty darn close to Christianity. And Christianity's got the accurate answers, where Islam, I don't think doesn't have all the accurate answers. Some answers that are right, but not all of them. Anybody else? Questions? Darwinian evolution, our discussion.
How readily available are the things in the icons of evolution that you're talking about? Like, so students that see these things and see them as not true, how easily do they go and find the things to support that those are not true?
Substantially. And most of them the evolutionists actually will agree with. So they'll agree that Ketwell's experiments were flawed. Miller-Urey experiment does not simulate the atmosphere of the Earth. So those things they will agree with you. And the movie, Icons of Evolution, they actually have evolutionists admitting that on camera. And Jonathan Wells does an okay job at footnoting. So you can look to other sources, and you can verify that from people that are actually evolutionists, but they say, yeah, that's bad evidence, that's bad evidence. Yeah, that's true, that's bad evidence. So his 10 icons they're not usually disputed. Maybe they do a little bit with horse evolution. There might be some more discussions about that, but a lot of these that we mentioned, the top 10, they actually agree on camera that these are not good evidences for evolution. But these are the top 10 that they give. So if your top 10 best reasons are all false, man, it doesn't appear that you have a very good argument. It appears that you have a very flimsy argument for your position. And it seems like it's in trouble. So you can use a gun and a baseball bat to continue to affirm your position, which is what's happening. So if you take a position of intelligent design, you might get fired from your teaching position. That's using force. You're bullying me. You're not trying to convince me intellectually. Why don't you convince me intellectually? Darwinian evolution is true. I'll happily accept it. Just give me the evidence. Convince me. Convince me of it. But instead of using evidence, you put a gun to my head. You tell me if you don't buy this, I'm going to fire you from your position. Well, that's not very rational. It's not very intellectual. It's not very kind. It's not very appropriate. This is what's happening. That's what the whole movie Expelled is about. If you don't buy the party position, we're going to kick you out. You're not going to have a position in academia. We're going to get rid of you. That's hardly scientific. And if it's so honkin' provable scientifically, gee whiz, give it to me. Please give it to me. I'm not that dumb. If the evidence is so overwhelming, just, man, give it to me. I'm open to the evidence. But there's not an appeal to the data. There's this rhetoric, and there's this power position, and there's this intimidation and this threats. Why do you need that? Why did the guy at Long Beach City College, when I said evolution is bad science and horrible philosophy, why does he attack me? Why does he berate me and raise his voice and yell and scream at me? You call yourself intelligent? You know, he's going after me. He's got a PhD in biology. Gee whiz, just dump the content on me. I've only had one biology course in my lifetime, junior in high school. Give it to me. My friend, give it to me. You got a PhD, I don't. Pile it up. Man, just dump truck the content on me. Well, why does he attack me instead of attack my bad argument? He didn't attack my argument, he attacked me. That shows he's got a poor argument. He's got a poor rebuttal. Either that or he's got very little self-control, which is probably true too. But I didn't get any data from him, zero data from him on that. I was like, whoa. And I'm fine with him getting ticked off because it actually proves my point more. He's actually ruined his own argument. If I berate you and hammer you, you know, like that, and I treat you like, dehumanize you, you're going to lose the argument. If anybody's observing, you lost the argument. I don't care how strong your data is, you lost the argument. You ought to treat people with respect and kindness, irregardless of their position. And I try to do that. I could strongly disagree, but I need to treat you with respect and with dignity. I need to hear you out. I need to listen to you. I need to be gentle. Doesn't mean I don't disagree strongly with your position. I can disagree and still like you. And I want to do that with the evolutionists. But I highly disagree with their theory. Highly. I don't think it's a good theory. Anybody else? How are we doing? So don't be intimidated. I don't know if some of you have ever taken courses on the secular college campus, but if you have, you know the experience. If you got a biology class or something else, there'll always be the professor. Usually he's an evolutionist, and he'll take pot shots at intelligent design and say that anybody that believes, you know, that evolution isn't true is just an idiot and stupid. That's not really fair to reality. Stephen Gould, I highly disagree with him, but he's an extremely intelligent and gifted individual. But I still disagree with him. But I acknowledge he's got great credentials when he was alive. You don't get to be a Harvard professor, full professor, and be dumb. You are incredibly intelligent, highly scholarly. So I need to acknowledge that with his credentials, and I respect those credentials. I just disagree with his conclusions. And so when people just poo-poo people that have a particular position on intelligent design and just degrade them in their character and their position, I think that's disrespectful and false. I don't think that's appropriate. And I see that happening frequently. They won't even have a discussion because you're not a scholar because you have this particular position. That's not good science. That's not good discussion ethics. So we're going to turn a corner, but let's begin to talk about the problem of evil. A lot of you in your papers, your first paper that you wrote for class mentioned this particular issue. In fact, in some cases, ad infinitum, lots of you mentioned this particular issue. How can such a good, caring, loving God allow for so much evil, pain, and suffering? Granted, it's a challenging question. I don't think it's as challenging as most Christians make it out to be. The problem of evil is often touted as the greatest challenge to a theistic concept of God, since theism makes grand claims about the power, love, knowledge, and ability of God. Thus, the existence and magnitude of evil appears to present a problem for theism. Evil is the kind of concept that is difficult to define, and yet we'd all agree on its reality. We recognize it and experience it, even if we can't adequately define it or agree on a definition. Most people at a minimum would include such things as extreme pain and suffering, violence done for gratification and greed, prosperity of bad men, and natural catastrophes like tsunamis and earthquakes and huge fires as evil. And in fact, those things are in fact evil, but there might be more to it than just meets the cursory look. I don't know if I used this story with you. I could have, but I guess I'm going to repeat it if you've heard it already. Let's say that my wife one day says to me, honey, let's go down to the mall and do some shopping for 24 hours straight and, you know, look at 25 stores for a couple of pieces of items and we'll never buy anything, but why don't you come along with me? And I think, no, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. I think I'll stay home, sweetheart. But, you know, please have fun. I hope you find some things. And so she goes down to the mall and you know, but, you know, a few hours transpire and she's still down there. I thought, oh, maybe I'll go down and have lunch with her, you know, go down, you know, see what she's, you know, doing and how much of my money she spent. I told my wife recently, we've got a good agreement. I make the money, you spend it. It's a very good agreement. It works very well. Makes you happy. Doesn't make me happy, but makes you happy. So I go down to the mall and I go to the food court and my wife is with another man. And all of a sudden they stand up from the table. She gives him a big hug and she kisses him on the cheek. I'm like, my wife is having an affair. No, never happened. My wife would never have an affair. I'm the weakest link on the chain. My wife is the strongest link. If somebody's going to have a problem, it's probably going to be me, not her. So, but I see this and I make a conclusion. I say, my wife is having an affair. I assume evil with this scenario that I'm sharing. But things could be different than I think that they are. Maybe her brother that I've never met was in town for a business deal that he found out very suddenly about, so he flew out without informing her, and he has a break in his schedule, and he calls her and he says, you know, sis, you know, I'm in town for a business deal, I have a couple hours free, can we have lunch? So they meet at the mall, they have lunch together. As he's leaving, she hugs her brother, kisses him on the cheek. They have a very good, good relationship as brother and sister. So actually what I observe as evil, and I ascribe to an affair, which is very morally wrong, actually is actually not the case. So I could observe something and I could misinterpret the data. So the same thing when we see evil, pain, or suffering, and we make some conclusions. Sometimes we make the conclusion, I think erroneously so, God really doesn't care a lot about me. Maybe God doesn't love me as much as he says he loves me. I'm experiencing lots of pain and suffering in my life. If God loved me so much, maybe I wouldn't be experiencing all this stuff. Evil. Evil could be being betrayed by your very best friend, who you thought you could trust, but in fact he stabs you in the back and totally rejects you, spits in your face. Says, get out of my life. I don't want you to be my friend anymore. Maybe evil is being pulled from your classroom chair, wrongly accused of stealing something and being grabbed by the shirt, around your neck with your shirt, being dragged out of your seat, being brought in front of the class, and being slapped repeatedly in front of your entire class. Maybe that's evil. Maybe evil is being wrongly accused of breaking into your high school teacher's house and stealing all kinds of items from her house. Maybe evil is being told by your superior as he's about to fire you from your job that you're just rebellious and unteachable, when your strongest qualities are teachability. Maybe evil is being fired from a job and being forced to move across the country. Maybe evil is living in fear that your parents would divorce because they argue and scream at night. All of those things are true of me. Or being criticized so profusely that you experience a year of depression and you wish that God would end your life so that life would be better. Those are all true of me. Those things all happen to me. God, do you really love me? God, do you really care about me? There's a difference between unpleasantness versus evil. Sitting on the I-5 for 3 years because the I-5 has become a parking lot, and you're there for 3 hours sitting in 100-degree temperatures. That's not very pleasant. It's not evil, but it's not pleasant. Getting a parking ticket for a time violation, it cost you $50 because it was in Los Angeles. That's not very fun. It's unpleasant, but it's not evil. Having your friends serve food that you greatly don't like and might cause some indigestion in your life. That's not evil, but it's unpleasant. Having it rain on your graduation day or your outside marriage day. That could be very unpleasant. It's not evil, but it's highly unpleasant. So sometimes we need to make a distinction between unpleasantness and evil. I love people a lot. People ask me, guys that I mentor, people that I interact with deeply, I say, you love me a lot, John. I do. Have you always been this way, John? Well, I've always loved people, but I haven't ever had the capacity that I presently do to give my heart to people. I have a much greater capacity presently. I was walking into church one day, this is actually back in Wisconsin, and one of my friends about my age, she said, John, you're a lot more soft and gentle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She said, how did that happen in your life? Huh. I started to cry. I said, pain. Pain. Lots and lots of pain. How did God increase my capacity to love? Lots of pain. I'm glad that I'm the person I am today. Not perfect, I have lots of flaws, but I'm glad for where I'm at this point in my life. I'm looking forward to the future. I want God to develop me more. But I'm happy with what God has done in my heart. He's made my heart very, very soft, very warm, very tender. But the way He's done that is to give me lots of hard times. He's pounded the living daylights out of me. He's put me into situations where I've experienced lots of pain and suffering, where I've experienced wrong criticism, high levels of criticism, unjustified criticism. Now we can respond to that. We can become very bitter, cynical, angry, belligerent, reactive. It's possible. For the believer, it's hopeful that we would become more developed, deeper character, have patience, sensitivity, gentleness, the fruit of the Spirit. That's the direction that God wants us to go in. So, God uses pain and suffering in our life to shape our character. I'm just like you. I don't like it. And when I begin to experience it, I can tend to initially react negatively. Although I have to say, in all honesty, I've never reacted in the way of saying, God, you don't love me or care about me. Quite frankly, I've never reacted like that. Because I'm absolutely convinced that God loves me a lot. I am absolutely convinced of it. My friend James was over my house one night, and he has spent a lot of time with me. He's the first person I've mentored when I came to California 15 years ago. I'd been praying the whole summer for God to give me at least one man to pour my life into. James, unknown to me, was praying the entire summer while he was working in Alaska that God would provide an older person in his life as a mentor. I met him the second week of the start of the school year at University of Redlands, and we connected very rapidly, and I've been mentoring him for 15 years. I said, James, are you convinced that I love you? He looks at me and says, oh, I'm absolutely convinced. I said, is there any doubt in your mind that I love you? He's like, no doubt. I know that you love me. I said, what would you say in response if you asked me to loan you $2,000? I could loan you $2,000 without any pain or any, hardship on my part, but I chose not to loan you that $2,000. How would you reconcile my decision not to loan you that $2,000 with my statement that I love you incredibly? He didn't hesitate for a half a second. He said, you know something that I don't know. And it's to my advantage that you don't loan me that money. He says, I may not understand, but I trust you because I know that you love me a lot. How we look at God and how we look at our world will have a very huge impact on how we interpret pain and suffering. I've never questioned in my Christian life that God loves me or cares about me. I've never questioned it. Part of the reason I've never questioned that is because I've had a fairly good relationship with my father. My mom and dad have 6 kids. They had a girl, 2 boys, then I was born, and then 2 more boys after me. And not because I was anything special, but when I was born, for I don't know what reasons, my dad actually took an interest in the family. And I was the recipient of a lot of his affection and attention. My siblings kid me that I was Dad's favorite child. That's true, I was. I may not be anymore, but I was then. And because of that attention and that affection, I had a very secure relationship with my father. And so it's a very easy move for me intellectually, because my earthly dad loves and cares about me, to conclude that my heavenly Father, God, loves and cares about me. It's very easy. That's a very easy step for me. And all of us have that kind of step. If we've got a bad father image, that's going to be a much more difficult and a bigger step. But I didn't have any problem in it. So my family background has contributed to my confidence and my acceptance that God cares about me a lot and He loves me a lot. I never doubt it. I've never doubted it. So that helps me to interpret these things that come into my life, the pain and suffering. So God uses pain and suffering to actually shape our character. When I was spending time in China, one of my new friends over there told me, he said, I'm jealous. I'm jealous that you're spending time with this other brother in Christ. And he got mad at me, angry. And I said, I am glad that you got jealous, because God is using this situation to surface problems in your life. And now that you're aware of it, you can trust God to work in this area of your life, this flaw, this character flaw in your life. So God's using the stress point to actually develop you as a person. God wants to use stress points to develop us as a person. Suffering in the Christian life is not an elective course. Apologetics, advanced apologetics, is an elective course at Biola. But pain and suffering is not an elective course in the Christian experience. If you've had a relatively problem-free, pain and suffering-free life, be of good cheer. It will change. You have pain and suffering coming down the pike. Because God doesn't care about you? Nada. God does care about you. Part of living in a fallen world is pain and suffering, because other people can make free moral choices, and those free moral choices can hurt you a lot. So my best friend in high school, who spit in my face at the basketball game, my senior year, spit in my face and said, get the heck out of my life, I don't want anything to do with you. That hurt me a lot. And he did it not because of anything wrong with me. But that decision actually caused me to become more energetic in my commitment to friendship, to value friendship more, and to work harder at friendship, and to seek to be a good friend. It didn't cause me to withdraw for the next 20 years. It actually motivated me that I'm going to work harder at having good friendships. And as I grew and mature, I'm going to be a little bit more careful who I enter into friendships with. Because not all people are good people, and not all people will make good friends. And I have to be careful at who I enter into significant friendships with. So I learned from those examples, or those that pain and suffering, those hard occurrences in my life. Times around the dinner table, my wife and I will talk about friends of ours that are getting divorces. Vast majority of the time, they're Christian couples. Early on in that discussion, a number of years ago, here in California, our kids were younger, and almost in unison, our 4 kids, which were around the dinner table that night, kind of chimed in at the same time and kind of looked more at me than at my wife, but said, Papa, are you going to get a divorce someday? I looked at my children, I said, absolutely not. It's never going to happen. I'll leave you with this quote, and then we'll pick up next week. But here's, I don't know who this is from. Out of the presses of pain come the soul's best wine. Out of the presses of pain comes the soul's best wine. Pain and suffering can shape our character, can deepen our character. For me, it's softened my heart, and it's given me a larger capacity through the grace of God to love people more. I am deeply thankful to God for what He's done in my life. If pain and suffering were an elective course, I guarantee you I would not be signing up for it. But it's not an elective, it's required coursework. And you're all going to take the coursework.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.